Welcome to my audio short story channel. Today's story is Curmudgeon. The synopsis is Olivia stops into a used bookstore hoping to find information about one of her favorite classic authors. Instead, what she finds is a mean old curmudgeon who needs her help in more ways than she could have imagined. Enjoy the story. I'll see you at the end. And also, tune in next week when I share insights about today's story. Curmudgeon, a short story by Janet Keller Richards. Copyright 2023, all rights reserved. A bell rang above my head to let someone know I was entering their used bookstore. As my eyes adjusted to the darker interior, I saw books cramming floor-to-ceiling shelves along every wall and stacks of books filling table surfaces throughout the rest of the store. The place smelled like a mixture of must and dust and old things in chests and reminded me of my grandma's attic where I'd played as a child. I inhaled the familiar scents and held them for a few nostalgic seconds before sighing contentedly and releasing them back into the room. A woman's voice called out to me, "Oh, bother! Give me a minute!" My eyes followed the voice toward the right side of the shop. "Thank you," I said, and took a few steps down the center aisle between several book-laden tables. I was hoping to find new information on one of my favorite authors for a report at school and had no idea where to start looking. One reason my attention was drawn to the person embodying the voice that had spoken to me. The woman was precariously perched on the third rung of a wooden ladder leaning against the wall of books on that side of the store. She was plump and elderly. Her white hair was carefully arranged in even rows of curls. Wearing a brown cardigan over a fern green skirt and black pumps with black nylons, she looked very much as though her attire had gotten frozen in time a few decades ago. I saw all of this from the back of her because the woman was facing the wall and reaching up to pull a book from a shelf above her head. Grasping the book in one hand, she held onto the ladder with her other hand and slowly began to descend. But when she got to the bottom rung of the ladder, the lady lost her grip. Her whole body catapulted backward, and she and the book went flying into the air. As she reached back to try and break her fall, the woman's hand hit the table behind her and spun her around. With a good measure of physical force, her upper body finally came to rest on top of books that had managed to stay on the table and not plummet to the floor from the weight of her landing. It all happened so quickly that by the time everything and everyone had finished toppling, I was just arriving at her side. "Are you all right?" The lady said nothing but stood up slowly, her eyes squinting with pain. She was holding her right wrist with her left hand. "Are you hurt?" I asked. "Shall I call 911? "No," the lady answered quite emphatically. "Don't do anything." She turned away from me and walked unsteadily to a nearby chair to sit down. I couldn't help myself, so I said, "But it looks like you're hurt, and if you are, it should be looked at." "Leave me alone," the woman snapped. "If you hadn't distracted me, I wouldn't have fallen. I don't want your help." I had no idea what to say. I had only come in for a book, and as far as I knew, I hadn't made any noises or movements that would have frightened her or made her lose her balance. But I could see by her expression she was really in pain. I took a step closer and persisted. "Then can I call anyone to come and help you? A son or a daughter or a neighbor?" Still holding her wrist, the woman looked at me and yelled. "I said I don't need help. I can walk to the hospital. Just go. You've done enough, so just go." I knew where the hospital was located because it was right beyond my high school. "But that's a mile from here. I'll be glad to drive you there." My car is right out front." She said nothing in response, as if she hadn't heard me. "I insist," I said. "Please." Scowling at me with a pained face that looked as though she was sucking on something very sour, she said sharply, "Oh, you're such a nuisance." Huffing loudly, she added, "Since none of this would have happened if you hadn't come in and disturbed me, I suppose you owe it to me." I still couldn't see how it was my fault, but maybe I had done something that had distracted her, so in some small way I could have contributed to her fall. "I'm very sorry if I frightened you." "You should be sorry. Get my purse from behind the cash register and stop wasting time. Can't you see I'm in pain?" I rushed behind the cash register. Thankfully, her purse was right there, and I didn't have to hunt for it and risk hearing another reprimand for wasting more time. I grabbed it and stood up to see the woman staring angrily my way from a standing position. Somehow, she'd managed to use her good hand to get herself up from her chair. Quickly retrieving my own purse off the top of the table where I'd thrown it in all the confusion, I turned and headed toward the door. My car was right in front of her bookshop. I helped the lady into the front passenger seat and set her purse on her lap. She was quiet and stared straight ahead, her whole face lined with that same combination of sourness and pain. At the emergency room entrance, I got out and opened her door and offered to help. "I don't need your help. I can do it myself," she said impatiently. Letting go of her wrist, she grabbed onto the frame of the car with her good hand and attempted to pull herself up to a standing position. But she wasn't strong enough and fell back onto her seat, crying out from the pain of jarring her injured wrist. "Let me help you," I said, and held out my hand. "Give me a minute." She inhaled several quick breaths before reluctantly taking my outstretched hand with her left hand. As gently as I could, I slowly pulled her out of the car. When she was standing securely, I said, "I'll park my car and then come and join you." "You dolt!" she shot back at me. "I don't want you to come and join me." I felt sorry for the woman and slightly responsible for her pain, but her rudeness was starting to get under my skin. "Then how will you carry your purse? And how will you get home?" I said with more unkindness than I intended. Letting go of her wounded wrist, she held out her left hand and insisted, "Give me my purse." I held it out to her and she took it. Carrying it in her left hand, she kept her wounded wrist upright and ambled slowly toward the hospital entrance. I went and parked my car. I sat there for a moment and wondered if I should leave. The woman obviously didn't want me to stay, but by the amount of paper-thin wrinkles on her hands, I knew she was probably around the age of my 83-year-old great-grandmother, and I would never consider letting Great-Grammy walk a mile with a hurt wrist. I couldn't leave, at least not until someone from her family arrived to be with her and then take her home. As the emergency room doors opened, I could hear a woman's voice hollering, "Why are you wasting time asking all these questions? I'm in pain and I need to see a doctor." Walking inside, I saw her standing at the check-in counter, facing a young lady seated behind a computer. Evidently, I wasn't the only target for the woman's razor-sharp tongue. Somehow, the desk worker convinced her to provide the necessary information, and she started to share her personal details at a volume the whole emergency room could hear. I now knew her name was Phyllis McNutt with no A and 2 T's, and her given address was identical to my GPS address for her bookstore, so apparently she lived in the same building. "I said I need to see a doctor. Are you deaf?" she barked at the woman behind the desk. I was positive the hospital worker was an angel because she never once raised her voice. And whatever she said temporarily mollified Mrs. McNutt, until she turned around to find a seat behind her and immediately saw me and let loose with, "What are you doing here? I said I don't want you to stay." Having her fiery eyes aimed at me made me stutter in defense of myself. I don't want you to have to walk home, but I can call someone else to pick you up if you give me their number." She intentionally turned away, sat down 4 seats away from me, set her purse on the chair beside her, and ignored me completely. Fidgeting with the clasp on her purse with her good hand, she tried to open it, but it appeared to be stuck. "Would you like me to try?" I asked. She sat back and silently looked straight ahead for a minute before saying rudely to the air in front of her, "Since this is all your fault, come and open this for me." I moved to the chair next to her purse. There was a thread binding the clasp. Once that was removed, her purse opened easily. She began to rummage in its compartments for something, but soon quit and sat back in her chair and mumbled, "Oh, bother." "May I help?" I said. "May I help?" she repeated in a sing-song mocking tone. "You could have helped by staying away from my shop, but it's too late for that." That did it. Everything in me wanted to get up and walk out and let her find her own way home. I mean, Great Grammy could be a bit crotchety at times, but this lady's insults were ridiculous. I stood and said as politely as I could, "I will be right back," and I walked outside to call Mom. She picked up right away. "Hi, honey," she said cheerfully. A small lump formed in my throat from talking to someone who loved me and was kind. "Hi, Mom." She must have heard the effects of the lump because she asked, "Is everything okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine. I just need some advice if you have a minute." I knew Mom was at work, but her boss allowed her to take personal calls if they weren't too frequent or too long. "Sure, Olivia. I have a few minutes." I told Mom all about the bookstore lady who was Great Grammy's age, and the fall and all the mean words she'd spoken. "Mom, she called me a dolt. What's a dolt?" Mom laughed. "I know how much you love words. I'll let you look it up on your phone later. But Olivia, you don't have to put up with her meanness." I protested. "I don't want her to have to walk home, but I haven't been able to get any information from her about someone else who could come and get her." "Honey, I'm not saying you should leave her there alone, but she needs to know you won't tolerate her intimidation." I exhaled a bucket load of air. "I don't know what you mean." Mom explained. "Tell her nicely that you understand she's in pain, but you expect to be spoken to in a polite manner. And the next time she says something to you in an unkind way, tell her, nicely, that you're going to get up and walk away for a while to give her the opportunity to calm down." "Mom, I can't do that." "Why not? She's browbeating you, Olivia." "But she'll yell at me." Mom answered, "If she yells, tell her calmly, 'I'm sorry, but I need to leave for a few minutes because I won't be disrespected.' And then walk outside and give her a few minutes before returning. Even if you need to do that 3 or 4 times, it should work." What Mom was saying seemed crazy, and I'd never done anything like it. I protested again. "But I'm too young. She won't listen to me." "Try it. If it doesn't work, call me back. Okay?" "I'll try it," I said, "but I'll probably be calling you back in 5 minutes to tell you it didn't work. You haven't met this lady, Mom. She's definitely a curmudgeon." Mom laughed again and said, "Well played, Olivia." I grinned, pleased with myself. Mom had only taught me that word last week while explaining one of Great-Grandma's crotchety moments. "Okay, dear. Let me know how it goes with Mrs. McNutt." "I will. Thanks, Mom." We said goodbye, and I put my phone in my purse and quietly rehearsed all the things Mom had told me to say. Then I screwed up my courage, walked back into the emergency room, and sat down near Mrs. McNutt. She was fumbling through her purse again, but stopped when I sat down and looked straight ahead at nothing in particular. "Mrs. McNutt," I said, but she interrupted before I could get any farther into Mom's suggested speech. "It's Miss McNutt," she corrected sternly. "And it's not Ms. McNutt either. I can't stand that modern expression. I'm glad to say I've never been married." "Yes, ma'am," I said, thinking to myself that as mean as she was being, it was no surprise she was never married. But I didn't say that. Instead, I continued with trying out Mom's advice. I wanted to say that I know you're in a lot of pain, but You're right, I am, and it's your fault." I closed my eyes and gritted my teeth. How was I going to get this out if she kept interrupting? There was no way this was going to succeed. But just so I could tell Mom I tried, I forged ahead. "Miss McNutt, I'm sorry you're experiencing pain, but I need to tell you that from now on, I expect to be spoken to politely. So if you say something to me in an unkind way, I will get up and walk away for a while to give you time to calm down." "Fine," she snapped harshly. "Go ahead and abandon me like everyone else has done. See if I care." A cloud of confusion floated through my brain, and it took me a few seconds to remember what I'd rehearsed. When it came back to me, I used Mom's exact words, plus a few more of my own, to reassure Miss McNutt. "I'm not abandoning you like other people have abandoned you. I'll be right outside, but I need to leave for a few minutes because I won't be disrespected." And then I stood and walked outside. I was so nervous, my body was shaking. I couldn't believe I'd just told the woman not to speak to me like that. I peeked through the windows of the emergency room to see what she was doing. She was sitting quietly and staring ahead into nothingness. I wondered if she was trying to come up with more mean things to say. After more than 5 minutes, I realized I couldn't stay outside forever, or she would think I was abandoning her. I headed back inside, mumbling under my breath, "Mom, I hope this works." I sat down. Miss McNutt was still holding her right wrist with her left hand. The rest of her was off in space again. I didn't know what to say, so I did my own staring routine, at my purse, and then at my hands, and then at my shoes. I knew someone had to break the awkward silence. It probably needed to be me. "How is your wrist?" I asked. "How do you think my wrist is feeling? It hurts," she snapped as sharply as before. Mom had told me I might have to get up and leave several times before the woman got the message, so I stood and parroted her advice. Nicely, of course. "I'm going to leave again for a little bit to give you time to calm down, because I won't be disrespected." I walked outside again. I was glad it was a nice day and not raining sideways like yesterday's thunderous weather. While I stood waiting, I looked up the definition of dolt on my phone and shook my head at Miss McNutt's spiteful choice of words. I glanced in the window again. She was holding her wrist, staring again at her invisible place. This time I waited a little longer to go back inside and sit down. When I did, she ignored me again, keeping up her important focus on thin air. I tried to come up with something to say, thinking that Mom's advice wasn't working, at least not so far, until she spoke. "My wrist is painful." It was the first time she hadn't yelled using her angry voice. "I'm so sorry you're in pain," I responded gently. After a short silence, she answered me in a normal tone of voice. "Thank you." This time I stared straight ahead, holding my breath and stifling a grin. Miss McNutt had spoken nicely 2 times in a row. We sat in the quiet, but it wasn't a stormy kind of quiet. It was more like a sun breaking through the clouds kind of quiet. I wanted to help her in some way. "Is there anything I can get for you? A drink of water, a cup of coffee, something from the cafe?" "I don't need your help," she snapped with her harsh voice. I could tell this old curmudgeon was really trying, but becoming a curmudgeon hadn't happened overnight. She'd had years of curmudgeon practice. I started to stand and tell her I won't be disrespected and that I was leaving again for a short time so she could calm down. But before I could say any of that, she threw a quick glance my way and then looked straight ahead and said, "I'm sorry," in a normal voice. I sat down again. "Thank you," I answered, to let her know I'd heard her normal voice apology. "If it's free, I could use some coffee," she said, in a normal tone of voice. I was so happy to get this woman coffee, I stood and said, "Of course, I'll track it down." I started to go ask the desk attendant where to find coffee and turned back to Miss McNutt to ask, "Cream, sugar?" She looked at me, the muscles around her mouth moving back and forth in a habit of working on words to spit out at others. Her lips finally said, in a normal voice, "Cream and 1 sugar, please." I found the coffee area just around the corner. It was free for anyone at the emergency room. As I poured her a cup and then a second one for myself, I couldn't help grinning widely. Mom's advice was working. Something inside of me felt stronger and empowered. I couldn't wait to call Mom and tell her. But for now, I had some coffee to deliver to a lonely old curmudgeon who was learning new ways. After we'd both downed our coffees, a nurse finally approached the woman. "Miss McNutt," she said, "it's about time!" The curmudgeon was back, but this time I didn't need to get up and leave because she wasn't slinging those words at me. The nurse said calmly, "Please follow me and we'll take a look at that wrist." As Miss McNutt stood and gathered her purse in her good hand, I said, "I'll be right here when you come out, don't worry." Her head jerked fast in my direction, and I could tell she wanted to let loose with a quick-tempered response. But instead, she pinched her lips together, pulled her shoulders back, and out of her mouth came the words, "Thank you," in a normal voice. 3 hours later, after I'd had lots of time to get homework done by borrowing paper from the front desk, and after I'd called my mom and told her all about the success of her great idea, Miss McNutt emerged from a back hallway. She was wearing a splint on her right wrist, cradled by a shoulder sling to hold it in place. I stood up to meet her. "How are you, Miss McNutt?" "How do you think I—" She stopped her snide question from jumping all the way out of her mouth. Screwing up her lips, she sighed and went to her unseen place for a few seconds before starting again. "I am tired." Her words came out honestly and in a normal voice. "Then stay right here. I'll go and get my car and we'll get you home." "Thank you," she responded. And you guessed it. It was in a normal tone of voice. On the way back to the bookstore, I said to her, "Miss McNutt, I really am concerned about you. Won't you please let me call a friend or a neighbor to come and help you?" She stared silently into her invisible world again, and that's when it occurred to me that curmudgeons can be rather prickly. It was entirely possible Miss McNutt didn't have any friends because they'd all gotten pricked too many times and left her alone. We found a parking space near the front of her bookstore. I got out to help her, and this time she accepted my hand to get out of the car. As I walked with her toward the bookstore entrance, I said as gently as I could, "You don't have anyone to help you, do you?" The old Miss McNutt angrily spat out, "I don't need anyone's help." But after a sigh, the new Miss McNutt countered with, "Thank you for driving me home. I will be fine." I wasn't sure she would be fine, especially since I had to help her find her key and open the shop door. She turned on the lights in the bookstore, and I helped her inside. "I'm fine now. You really have done enough," the new Miss McNutt said quietly. I thought of Great Grammy and the things she could no longer do well under normal circumstances, not to mention trying to do things while incapacitated. Something in me rose up and said, "Well, since your bookstore is close to my high school, I'll stop by after school tomorrow, around 4 o'clock, in case you think of any groceries or other errands you need me to run. I'll see you then." Without waiting for her to answer, I hurried out the door and got in my car. The next day, when I got to the bookshop, it was closed. Taped to the inside of the door was a sign informing the public it would reopen the following Monday. An envelope was also taped on the outside of the door. The words, "To the girl who drove me to the hospital," were written untidily across its front. I removed it and looked inside. It held $40 in cash and a typed note that read, "I do need a few groceries. If you could please get me a rotisserie chicken and 2 containers of mashed potatoes from the deli section, and also a 1-pound bag of frozen broccoli, I will be grateful. Thank you very much. And when you return, ring the doorbell and I will come down." She signed the note, Miss McNutt. There was a P.S. added at the bottom that read, "I never asked your name." I had several thoughts. First, she sure was a trusting soul to tape cash in an envelope on the outside of the shop door. And second, she sounded much kinder on paper than in person. It didn't take long for me to get her groceries and return. Retrieving them from the trunk of my car, I rang the doorbell. The lights in the shop came on, and through the glass in the door, I watched her slowly walk down the center aisle, her right arm in the sling. When she finally managed to get the key in the door and unlock it using her good hand, I said cheerily, "Hello, Miss McNutt." "Hello, She stopped speaking, but sounded as though she wanted to say more. "Olivia, I'm Olivia." "Olivia?" she said with wide-eyed astonishment. "Do you know someone by that name?" I asked. Her countenance turned serious. "Yes, my sister." "I hope she's a nice person," I said, trying to keep the conversation on the positive side. "You remind me of her." "I'll take that as a compliment," I joked, and I was certain I saw her downturned lips leveling out to a straight line. Would you like me to bring these in for you?" I was still standing on the sidewalk holding 2 plastic grocery bags of food. "I'll take them," she answered. "But I don't think you'll be able to carry all of them in one hand." Miss McNutt's anger flashed out at me as she said impatiently, "Well, just put them on the counter and I'll take them one at a time." I set them on the counter near the cash register. I really wanted to figure out what made this lady fly off the handle. Last night I'd told my mom what Miss McNutt had said about everyone abandoning her. Mom explained that she could be using anger to push people away because she didn't want to risk being abandoned again. I had felt sorry for her when Mom pointed that out, but now her prickliness was making it difficult to be nice. Maybe it was not wanting to be pricked that caused me to say the honest words I spoke next, because except for my family and close friends, who accepted me no matter what, being transparent with others was not one of my greatest strengths. I blurted out, "Miss McNutt, if you're using anger because you're afraid I'm going to abandon you, don't worry. I love books, and obviously you love books, so we have something in common. And just because I'm young and you're experienced doesn't mean we can't learn to get along and enjoy each other's company." I was so glad I hadn't said she was old, but after dumping exactly what I thought into the air around us, I could feel blood rushing to my face, turning my pale skin bright red and making me break out into a sweat. Miss McNutt was staring again, but not at the usual nothingness in front of her. She was staring directly at me. But instead of her eyes shooting out fire, they were searching my face, as though a younger Miss McNutt was watching me carefully from deep inside her soul. Her visual interrogation went on for a minute or so. I finally looked away and said apologetically, "If I spoke too openly, forgive me. She interrupted me. "Why did you come into my shop yesterday?" Her question caught me off guard, so it took a few seconds for me to respond. "Oh, I wanted to know if you might possibly have any books about Mackenzie Rutherford." At hearing my answer, Miss McNutt blinked hard and inhaled so sharply it sent her into a coughing fit. After her coughing subsided, her mouth started moving back and forth in its habit of working up words. "Come back tomorrow," she said, and promptly closed the shop door without waiting for my response. When I stopped by the next afternoon, there was no envelope on the door, so I rang the doorbell. After a minute or so, the lights in the bookstore came on, and Miss McNutt slowly made her way down the center aisle. With her good hand, she unlocked the door and opened it. "Come in," she said, with calm in her voice. I greeted her with, "Hello, Miss McNutt," and intentionally avoided asking about her wrist because her inner curmudgeon didn't seem to like discussing pain. "Would you like to come upstairs to my apartment?" "What?" I asked. "Would you like to come upstairs to my apartment?" There were no barbs attached to her question. "Yes," I said, "I would like to." Her second-floor apartment was cozy. We entered the living room, which had a worn area rug and several stuffed chairs from the same era as the furniture in my great-Grammy's place. Miss McNutt gestured to a well-worn rose-colored stuffed chair. "Please, sit down." While I sat, she went over to one of her bookshelves, pulled out a book, and then turned and handed it to me. Its title was Son of the Bright One by Mackenzie Rutherford. "You have an original copy?" I was amazed because the book had been out of print for 50 years and copies were hard to come by. "Of course," she answered, as if having a semi-rare book on her bookshelf was a common experience. I was intrigued. I'd come to Miss McNutt's bookstore hoping to find information about Rutherford, who was one of my favorite classic authors. But here I was, holding one of his actual books in my hand. "May I open it?" "Certainly," she said, as she moved to her own stuffed chair and sat down, gingerly watching over her right wrist in the process. I opened to the book's title page and saw a handwritten note. It felt rude to read it, so I started to turn the page. But the name signed at the bottom of the note caught my eye, and I gasped. "You own an inscribed copy?" "I knew him personally," she said, her eyes starting to wander to that silent place in space. "He's one of my favorite classic authors! And you have a presentation copy with a personal note written to you." My comments brought her back to the room. Her countenance turned serious, and she said simply, "Yes." I thought I saw her eyes beginning to mist over. I had studied the life of Mackenzie Rutherford, so I knew that soon after his second book was published, he'd been killed in a car accident. While turning another page, I commented, "He died when he was young." I ran my hand across the page, feeling the thrill of touching a book that Rutherford had once held in his own hands. I added wistfully, "I wish he'd been able to live longer and write more books." "Yes," Miss McNutt said. "He was 25 when he died." "If you don't mind my asking, did you know him well?" I was partially distracted when I asked the question because I was realizing the signed book I held in my hands had to be worth significant monetary value. It was mesmerizing in every way. Old books have a unique scent, so I leaned down to inhale its aroma. When I sat up, I became aware Miss McNutt had never answered my question about how well she'd known Rutherford. By now, I was sure they had known each other well. It was a gut feeling I had from seeing the longing in her gaze. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked that question." She responded, "I have never talked about him since that day, until now. But God knows I can't bring him back, and based on his writings of heaven, he wouldn't want to come back." I felt like I was watching the last gasps of a dying curmudgeon. Her words and demeanor were entirely the opposite of the irate Miss McNutt I'd met a few days ago. She rose from her chair and walked toward the kitchen. "Would you like some tea?" she asked. I wasn't a tea drinker, but if she was offering tea, then I would have tea. "Sure, I would love some." While she put the kettle on the stove, I turned back to the book title page. I had to know what he'd written to her. Looking at the handwritten note, I read, "To my dear Philly, I'm so excited we get to spend the rest of our lives together. I love you more than words can express, and I can't wait until our wedding day. Your Mac, forever." His full name was signed at the bottom. My heart was pounding. Poor Miss McNutt had lost the sweet love of her life. Without meaning to, he'd abandoned her by dying, and she'd lived as a single woman for all the decades that followed. I looked up to see her standing in front of me, watching my eyes fill with tears. I felt so guilty for reading a very private note that was none of my business. "Mackenzie and I were going to be married," she said. "I am sorry, Miss McNutt. Really I am. What a sad thing to have lost the love of your life, and at such a young age. I can see why you felt abandoned." I stopped and shuddered internally. Why was I being so bluntly honest with this lady? I focused on the book, afraid to meet her eyes, afraid of being verbally blasted for bringing up such a tender subject. "You're right," she said in a normal voice. I risked looking up. Her eyes were normal, like her voice. "I have felt abandoned, and I've been angry for a very long time. My sister Olivia, the person you remind me of, also died in that accident. I was the only one who survived." My hand flew to my mouth, and I said truthfully, "Oh, I am so sorry. What a horrible tragedy you've experienced." Yes, it was a tragedy, but it happened many years ago, and you have helped me realize it's time to cut the strings and let them both go with God, as they say. She looked at me serenely. "Thank you, Olivia." My heart was beginning to fill with affection for this dear woman. "I have no idea how I helped you, but I am so glad for you." Carrying our teacups to the living room, Miss McNutt set them down on the coffee table and then sat down again in her chair. I closed the book and carefully laid it aside. Picking up my teacup, I said, "Thank you again for letting me see such a wonderful book. It really is a treasure." I paused and then added, "And thank you for inviting me into your life. I just know we're going to like each other a lot." The wrinkles around Miss McNutt's mouth got a workout as they stretched into a full and wide smile. She laughed out loud and said, "Yes, I'm sure of it." We talked about Mackenzie Rutherford's books until it was time for me to go. Then she carefully descended the stairs with me to unlock the shop door. As we stood in the entryway, I handed her a piece of paper with my phone number on it. "Call me if you need anything, and tomorrow after school, I'll stop by to see how you're doing." As she took the paper, she asked, "Would you like to work at the bookstore on Saturdays?" I blinked in surprise at her question, but knew my answer immediately. I would love that. Let me talk to my parents, and I'll confirm it with you." As I said goodbye and headed for home, I got so excited about the idea of working around all those used books and discussing them with someone who valued them as much as I valued them. And then I thought of Miss McNutt. The books in her bookstore were nothing in comparison to her life story, which was a real classic and a rare find. I couldn't wait to turn the page and see what happens next. Thank you so much for listening. I trust you enjoyed the story. Of course, I'm always interested in what you have to say about it, so please leave a comment below. And join me next week when I share about today's story, where the idea came from, how it applies to life, and how it builds hope, etc. Also, in the description below, you will find a link to the written form of today's story, as well as information about my allegorical novel and other books I've written. And finally, as you can imagine, it does take time to write, edit, and record these stories. If you enjoy them, please consider supporting their creation with a one-time thanks. I will see you next week, and until then, I hope you have a great week.